Pacific Theater, 1944. American soldiers huddled in jungle foxholes tune their radios to escape the monotony and terror of war. They're searching for music, news from home, anything to remind them of normalcy. Instead, they find her. A seductive voice speaking perfect English, playing American jazz and swing music. She calls herself Tokyo Rose, though that's not her real name. She tells the soldiers their girlfriends are cheating on them back home. She says their mission is hopeless. She claims Japan is winning the war. But hidden within these propaganda broadcasts, buried beneath the lies and psychological warfare, are secret signals. Coded messages that only certain listeners can decode. Intelligence transmitted in plain sight, disguised as entertainment and propaganda. Because Radio Tokyo isn't just spreading lies, it's simultaneously operating as an espionage communications network, sending encrypted information across the Pacific using the same broadcasts that millions hear as simple propaganda. This is a story more complex than history remembers. Radio Tokyo employed multiple female broadcasters, at least a dozen women who Americans collectively called Tokyo Rose. But among them were double agents, coerced prisoners, and women playing dangerous games with their own identities. Some were loyal to Japan, others secretly served the Allies, and the broadcasts themselves contained layers of meaning. Propaganda for most listeners, but intelligence signals for those who knew how to decode them. This is Cipher Tales. Today, we decode one of World War II's most sophisticated propaganda and espionage operations, Radio Tokyo's dual-purpose broadcasts that simultaneously demoralized Allied soldiers and transmitted secret intelligence. This is the story of the women forced to speak into microphones, the lies they were ordered to tell, the secret signals hidden in their broadcasts, and the intelligence war fought through radio waves across the Pacific. This is the story of how Tokyo Rose was never one person, but a weapon with multiple faces, and how that weapon cut both ways. The Voice. Who was Tokyo Rose? The first thing to understand about Tokyo Rose is that she never existed, not as a single person. Tokyo Rose was a collective myth created by American soldiers who heard various English-language female broadcasters on Japanese radio and merged them into one symbolic enemy. The reality was far more complex and far more interesting than the legend. Radio Tokyo's English-language service employed numerous women throughout World War II. Some were Japanese nationals fluent in English. Others were Americans of Japanese ancestry who'd been trapped in Japan when war began. Still others were Allied prisoners of war forced to broadcast under threat of execution. Each had different voices, different broadcasting styles, different levels of enthusiasm or reluctance for their propaganda work. The most famous woman later associated with the Tokyo Rose legend was Iva Toguri, an American citizen of Japanese descent who'd been visiting relatives in Japan when Pearl Harbor attacked. Stranded in Japan, unable to return to America, Toguri eventually took work at Radio Tokyo as a typist and later as a broadcaster. She claimed throughout her life that she'd been forced into the role and had attempted to undermine Japanese propaganda through subtle sabotage, similar to Edward Dates's techniques in Nazi Germany. But Toguri was just one voice among many. Ruth Hayakawa, another American-Japanese woman, also broadcast for Radio Tokyo. So did Myrtle Lipton, an Australian nurse captured by Japanese forces. Each brought different perspectives, different motivations, and different relationships with their captors and their work. Some genuinely supported Japan's war effort. Others were coerced prisoners doing whatever necessary to survive. The Japanese military understood radio propaganda's power. They'd studied Nazi Germany's successful use of radio to spread propaganda across Europe. They'd analyzed how Lord Haha's broadcasts from Berlin had attempted to demoralize British civilians. The Japanese military wanted similar capabilities for psychological warfare against Allied forces in the Pacific. Radio Tokyo's English-language service launched before Pearl Harbor, but expanded dramatically once war began. The broadcasts targeted American and Allied forces throughout the Pacific, in Australia, the Philippines, Burma, China, and on countless islands where American forces fought desperate campaigns against Japanese defenders. The goals were straightforward: undermine enemy morale, create doubt about the war's purpose, exploit homesickness and fear, and convince Allied soldiers their cause was hopeless. The broadcasts followed sophisticated psychological warfare principles. They didn't simply shout Japanese propaganda. That would be dismissed immediately. Instead, they created entertainment programming that attracted listeners with music, then inserted propaganda between songs. A typical broadcast might play Glenn Miller's orchestra, then discuss recent American military setbacks, then play Benny Goodman, then read letters supposedly from American wives asking their soldier husbands to come home. The female broadcasters were chosen deliberately. Japanese psychological warfare experts understood that male soldiers fighting in isolated jungle conditions would be more likely to listen to female voices which reminded them of girlfriends, wives, and mothers left behind. The broadcasts exploited this loneliness, using seductive tones to attract attention, then delivering psychological warfare messages designed to erode fighting spirit. But beneath this obvious propaganda operation ran a more sophisticated intelligence network. Radio Tokyo's broadcasts contained coded messages intended for Japanese agents operating throughout the Pacific, in Allied territories, and even within Allied military units. These codes had to be subtle enough that American counterintelligence monitoring the broadcasts wouldn't detect them, but clear enough for trained Japanese intelligence officers to decode. The lies, propaganda techniques. Radio Tokyo's propaganda was remarkably sophisticated, employing psychological warfare techniques that exploited every vulnerability of Allied soldiers fighting in brutal Pacific campaigns. Understanding these propaganda methods reveals both Japanese strategic thinking and the psychological pressures faced by soldiers hearing these broadcasts.
The core propaganda strategy was creating doubt, not necessarily making soldiers believe Japanese claims, but simply planting seeds of uncertainty that would grow in the isolated, terrifying conditions of Pacific combat. The broadcasters rarely made outrageous claims that would be obviously false. Instead, they mixed truth with lies, creating confusion about what was real. For example, Radio Tokyo would report genuine American military casualties, citing actual unit numbers and locations. This information came from Japanese intelligence sources, captured documents, and battlefield observations. By reporting accurate information alongside propaganda, the broadcasts established credibility. Soldiers hearing correct details about their own unit's experiences might then believe other claims that were actually false. The most psychologically damaging propaganda targeted soldiers' personal anxieties. Tokyo Rose broadcasts frequently discussed infidelity, suggesting that American women back home were dating other men while their boyfriends and husbands fought overseas. These claims exploited real fears. Soldiers away from home for years worried constantly about maintaining relationships across impossible distances. The broadcasts would describe specific locations where servicemen's girlfriends supposedly spent time: nightclubs in San Francisco, dance halls in New York, beaches in California. They'd play romantic music and suggest that women were enjoying themselves with men who'd avoided military service. This psychological warfare was cruel and effective, creating jealousy, resentment, and homesickness that eroded morale. Economic propaganda targeted another vulnerability. Radio Tokyo broadcasts emphasized the wealth that factory workers and businessmen back home were accumulating while soldiers earned minimal military pay. They described the economic boom in America, contrasting it with the poverty and danger that soldiers faced. The message was clear: you're risking your life for nothing, while others get rich. Racial propaganda attempted to exploit tensions within American society and military. Japanese broadcasts specifically targeted African American soldiers, pointing out racial discrimination they faced in America and questioning why they'd fight for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. Similar messages targeted other minority groups. This propaganda was cynically manipulative. Japan's own society was rigidly hierarchical and racist, but it attempted to weaponize America's real social problems. Military propaganda focused on the futility of fighting Japan. Radio Tokyo broadcasts claimed Japanese forces were invincible, that every American advance resulted in massive casualties, that Japan had unlimited resources and unbreakable will. They described specific battles where American forces had suffered heavy losses, emphasizing the horror and waste of war. The broadcasts also spread rumors designed to create confusion and fear. They'd claimed that certain Allied units had been wiped out, that particular ships had been sunk, that specific military operations had failed catastrophically. Some of these claims were true, others completely fabricated. The mix of truth and lies made it impossible for soldiers to know what to believe. One particularly insidious technique was reading names of American prisoners of war, sometimes accurately, sometimes fictitiously. Families listening in America would hear their sons' or husbands' names mentioned, creating terrible uncertainty about whether their loved ones were alive, dead, or imprisoned. This psychological torture affected both soldiers and civilians. The music selection itself was propaganda. Radio Tokyo played American jazz, swing, and popular music, genuine American culture that attracted homesick soldiers. But the music was always melancholic, romantic, nostalgic, songs that emphasized longing, loss, and sadness. The emotional manipulation was subtle but powerful, using music to create psychological states that made soldiers more susceptible to propaganda messages. Weather and operational information was sometimes broadcast in ways that seemed helpful, but actually served Japanese intelligence purposes. By accurately reporting weather conditions or discussing troop movements, information Japanese intelligence already knew, Radio Tokyo appeared to be providing useful information to American forces. But these broadcasts helped Japanese commanders understand what information the Allies had access to and could be used for counterintelligence purposes. The secret signals, hidden intelligence. But Radio Tokyo's broadcasts served purposes beyond obvious propaganda. Hidden within the entertainment and psychological warfare were coded messages transmitting intelligence to Japanese agents throughout the Pacific. These codes operated on multiple levels, visible to everyone, but readable only by those trained to decode them. The simplest codes involved specific songs played in particular orders. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring Radio Tokyo broadcasts would listen for certain musical selections played in predetermined sequences. For example, playing Moonlight Serenade followed immediately by In the Mood might signal that a particular intelligence operation should proceed as planned. Playing them in reverse order might mean abort the mission. These musical codes were nearly impossible for Allied counterintelligence to detect because there were legitimate reasons for playing any particular songs. They were simply popular American music. Even if Allied intelligence noticed patterns, interpreting them without knowing the codebook was practically impossible. The Japanese could change the meanings regularly, making decryption even more difficult.
Verbal codes were embedded in the propaganda scripts themselves. Certain phrases, unusual word choices, or specific references could carry hidden meanings. A seemingly innocuous mention of weather conditions might actually signal troop movements. A casual reference to a particular American city might indicate where Japanese agents should focus intelligence-gathering efforts. For example, a Tokyo Rose broadcast might include the phrase, "Cherry blossoms are particularly beautiful this year in San Francisco." To most listeners, this sounds like nostalgic commentary about spring in California. But to a Japanese intelligence officer, cherry blossoms might be code for naval intelligence. Particularly beautiful might indicate high-priority information. This year could reference a specific time window. And San Francisco might actually mean Pearl Harbor or another location, according to a predetermined substitution cipher. Numbers were hidden throughout broadcasts in various ways. A broadcaster might mention that a particular song was number 7 on the hit parade, that tomorrow's broadcast would begin at 8 o'clock,
that a certain battle occurred on the 12th of the month. These seemingly random numbers could encode coordinates, dates, quantities, or other intelligence data when decoded using predetermined systems. Prisoner of war name lists served dual purposes. While their obvious function was psychological warfare, broadcasting names to worry families and demonstrate Japanese power, they also could contain coded intelligence. The order in which names were read, which names were included or excluded, or specific details mentioned about prisoners could all carry hidden information. Some codes exploited the multiple broadcasters' voices. If a particular woman broadcast on a specific day, that itself could signal information. The choice of which broadcaster handled which program could indicate intelligence priorities, operational status, or responses to Allied activities. Allied intelligence monitoring Radio Tokyo would hear seemingly random variation in broadcasters, unaware that the variations themselves were messages. Technical aspects of the broadcasts contained codes. Subtle variations in transmission frequencies, broadcast timing, or signal strength could carry information detectable by properly equipped receivers, but invisible to standard radio sets. Japanese intelligence used sophisticated radio technology to hide data within normal broadcast signals, an early form of steganography using radio technology. The Japanese also used Radio Tokyo broadcasts to coordinate with submarines. Japanese submarines operating throughout the Pacific needed to maintain communication with headquarters, but couldn't transmit frequently without revealing their positions to Allied directing finding equipment. Radio Tokyo broadcasts could transmit orders and information that submarines could receive passively without transmitting, and thus without being detected. One documented example involved coordinating submarine supply operations. Japanese submarines would rendezvous with supply ships at predetermined locations, but these locations might need to change based on Allied naval movements. Radio Tokyo could broadcast the new coordinates hidden in seemingly innocent programming, perhaps encoded in the broadcast's time slot, the songs played, or phrases in the propaganda script. The sophistication of these codes varied. Some were simple substitution ciphers that would be relatively easy to break if detected. Others were complex systems involving multiple layers of encoding, substitution tables that changed regularly, and references to physical code books that Japanese agents possessed. The Japanese understood that their codes would eventually be compromised, so they used multiple systems simultaneously and rotated them frequently. Allied intelligence was aware that Radio Tokyo broadcasts probably contained coded messages, but struggled to decode them systematically. American and Australian code-breaking operations focused primarily on Japanese military and diplomatic communications transmitted through traditional encrypted channels. The idea that entertainment radio broadcasts contained intelligence seemed almost too clever, hiding codes in plain sight, where millions could hear them but only a few could read them. The prisoners, women caught between sides. Among Radio Tokyo's broadcasters were Allied prisoners of war forced to speak into microphones under threat of death. Their stories reveal the impossible choices forced on people caught between warring powers, and how some attempted to resist even while appearing to collaborate. Myrtle Lipton was an Australian army nurse captured when Singapore fell to Japanese forces in February 1942. Along with thousands of other Allied prisoners, Lipton endured brutal captivity in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps. Conditions were horrific: starvation rations, disease, torture, and casual murder by guards. Survival required doing whatever captors demanded. Japanese psychological warfare officers identified English-speaking prisoners who could be forced to broadcast propaganda. Lipton was selected because of her clear voice, her nursing background that made her seem credible discussing medical topics, and her vulnerable position as a female prisoner completely at her captor's mercy. She was given a choice that wasn't really a choice: broadcast propaganda or face execution. Lipton agreed to broadcast, joining other coerced prisoners reading scripts written by Japanese propaganda officials. But like some other prisoners in similar situations, Lipton attempted subtle resistance. She would read scripts with slightly wrong inflections, emphasizing certain words in ways that communicated skepticism rather than conviction. She'd make tiny mistakes that altered meanings slightly. She'd inject hesitations that suggested she didn't believe what she was saying. These acts of resistance were incredibly dangerous. Japanese guards monitoring broadcasts watched for any signs of sabotage or insufficient enthusiasm. Prisoners who failed to broadcast propaganda convincingly faced beatings, torture, or execution. Lipton and others like her walked an impossible line, appearing to collaborate enough to survive, while subtly undermining the propaganda they were forced to speak.
American prisoner of war Major General William F. Sharp discovered that several American soldiers were being forced to broadcast from prison camps. Sharp himself was approached to broadcast but refused, accepting punishment rather than participate in propaganda. Other prisoners made different calculations, believing that survival justified temporary cooperation, or that they might find ways to subtly sabotage propaganda while appearing to comply. The women forced to broadcast faced particular pressures. Japanese military culture was deeply misogynistic, and female prisoners were especially vulnerable to abuse. Broadcasting propaganda at least provided some protection. Prisoners valued for propaganda purposes received slightly better treatment than general prison populations. This created agonizing calculations: collaborate to survive, or resist and face torture or death. Some coerced broadcasters attempted to send coded messages of their own, warning Allied forces or providing intelligence. They'd try to insert information about prison camp locations, numbers of prisoners, or camp conditions into their broadcasts. These attempts were extremely dangerous. If Japanese censors detected unauthorized information, punishment was severe. But some prisoners believed the risk was worthwhile if they could provide intelligence that might help Allied forces. Iva de Gori, the American woman later most associated with Tokyo Ro's identity, occupied an ambiguous position. She wasn't technically a prisoner. She was a civilian stranded in Japan. But as an American in wartime Japan, she faced intense pressure and limited options. She claimed she took the broadcasting job reluctantly and attempted to undermine propaganda through subtle sabotage similar to Deitz techniques in Nazi Germany. After the war, Tagore was prosecuted for treason in one of the most controversial trials in American history. She was convicted largely on testimony from other Radio Tokyo employees who themselves faced prosecution and may have testified against her to save themselves. Tagore served 6 years in prison before being released. Decades later, after extensive investigation revealed prosecutorial misconduct and false testimony, President Gerald Ford pardoned her in 1977. Tagore's story became symbolic of complex questions about collaboration, coercion, and survival in wartime. Was she a traitor who willingly broadcast enemy propaganda? Or was she a victim forced into impossible situations and later scapegoated because America needed someone to embody the Tokyo Rose myth? The truth was probably somewhere between. A person making difficult choices in terrible circumstances, neither pure villain nor pure victim, but simply human. The same complexity applied to other Radio Tokyo broadcasters. Some genuinely supported Japan's war effort. Others were coerced prisoners doing whatever necessary to survive. Still others occupied gray areas, perhaps initially coerced but eventually accommodating to their situations, or perhaps secretly resisting while appearing to collaborate. Each woman's story was unique,
but all were caught in the machinery of war propaganda, used as tools by forces far beyond their control. The listeners, American responses. American soldiers' responses to Radio Tokyo broadcasts were more complex than simple propaganda effectiveness or resistance. The broadcasts became part of Pacific War culture, listened to for entertainment, mocked for their obvious propaganda, but also sometimes affecting morale in ways military commanders worried about. Many soldiers listened to Radio Tokyo primarily for the music. American military radio services in the Pacific were limited and often unavailable to troops in forward positions. Radio Tokyo provided the only reliable source of American popular music for soldiers desperate for any connection to home. They'd tune in for the swing and jazz, enduring the propaganda to hear Glenn Miller or Frank Sinatra. This created a strange relationship between propaganda and entertainment. Soldiers would laugh at Tokyo Rose's obvious lies while simultaneously enjoying the music she played. They'd mock her claims about girlfriend's infidelity while also feeling twinges of jealous worry. The propaganda didn't convince them Japan was winning, but it gnawed at psychological vulnerabilities, creating doubts and anxieties that accumulated over months and years of brutal combat. Military commanders were concerned enough about Tokyo Radio's potential effects that they issued guidance about listening to enemy propaganda. Official policy discouraged soldiers from tuning into Japanese broadcasts, but enforcement was impossible. Radios were everywhere, soldiers had limited entertainment options, and forbidding something often made it more appealing. Commanders had to accept that soldiers would listen and focus on countering propaganda's effects rather than preventing exposure. Some military units turned listening to Radio Tokyo into group activities that defused propaganda through mockery. Soldiers would gather around radios, competing to make the funniest jokes about Tokyo Rose's claims. This collective ridicule transformed propaganda into entertainment, reducing its psychological impact by making it a source of humor rather than doubt. But not all soldiers were immune to propaganda's effects. Those already struggling with morale, soldiers exhausted by prolonged combat, those who'd lost close friends, those receiving bad news from home, were more vulnerable to psychological warfare. For them, Tokyo Rose's suggestions that the war was futile and going home was better than dying for nothing found receptive audiences. Letters home sometimes mentioned Radio Tokyo broadcasts, with soldiers assuring families not to worry about propaganda, but also revealing that the broadcasts had affected them more than they wanted to admit. The very act of writing to reassure families that girlfriends weren't actually cheating revealed that the propaganda had planted those worries successfully. Allied psychological warfare experts studied Radio Tokyo broadcasts carefully, analyzing techniques to understand propaganda effectiveness and develop countermeasures. They recognized sophisticated elements, the mix of truth and lies, the exploitation of genuine anxieties, the subtle psychological manipulation through music and tone. This analysis informed Allied propaganda directed at Japanese forces and influenced post-war understanding of psychological warfare.
Counter-propaganda efforts attempted to inoculate soldiers against Radio Tokyo's psychological warfare. American military newspapers published articles mocking Tokyo Rose and explaining propaganda techniques. Military chaplains addressed morale issues in ways that countered propaganda themes. Entertainment programs brought American performers to Pacific bases, providing alternatives to Japanese radio broadcasts. But the most effective counter to Radio Tokyo propaganda was military success. As Allied forces advanced across the Pacific, liberating islands and pushing toward Japan, the obvious falsity of Tokyo Rose's claims about Japanese invincibility became undeniable. Propaganda claiming Japan was winning was absurd when American forces were clearly winning. Success was the best counter-propaganda. Some soldiers actually used Radio Tokyo broadcasts to gather intelligence themselves.
They'd listen carefully to what Japanese propaganda emphasized, deducing Japanese concerns from propaganda themes. If Radio Tokyo broadcasts suddenly focused heavily on a particular region, it might indicate Japanese reinforcement efforts there. If propaganda avoided mentioning specific battles, it might suggest Japanese defeats. Soldiers turned enemy propaganda into intelligence by reading between the lies. The codes broken. Allied intelligence discovers the signals. Allied intelligence eventually discovered that Radio Tokyo broadcasts contained coded messages, though the extent of their understanding and success in decryption remains partially classified even decades later. The process of detecting and decoding these hidden signals reveals both Allied intelligence capabilities and the challenges of breaking sophisticated codes hidden in entertainment broadcasts. The first hints that Radio Tokyo might contain coded intelligence came from pattern analysis. Allied signals intelligence officers monitoring Japanese broadcasts noticed subtle regularities. Certain songs played more frequently than random selection would suggest, unusual phrases appearing repeatedly, timing patterns that seemed too consistent to be coincidental. These patterns indicated possible codes, though proving it required extensive analysis. Australian signals intelligence, particularly the Central Bureau in Brisbane, focused significant effort on Japanese communications. Australian codebreakers worked alongside American counterparts, tackling Japanese military codes, diplomatic ciphers, and merchant shipping communications. Some analysts began studying Radio Tokyo broadcasts, looking for hidden intelligence. The challenge was enormous. Unlike traditional encrypted messages with clear ciphertext, Radio Tokyo codes were hidden in seemingly normal programming. There was no obvious encrypted message to attack using conventional cryptanalysis. Instead, analysts had to identify what might be code within hours of entertainment broadcasting, then hypothesize encoding methods and test them against intercepted Japanese intelligence communications to see if they matched. One breakthrough came from comparing Radio Tokyo broadcast details with known Japanese military operations. Analysts noticed that certain broadcast changes, a particular song played, a specific broadcaster used, an unusual phrase mentioned, sometimes preceded Japanese military activities by days or weeks. This correlation suggested the broadcasts were indeed signaling operational information. Cryptanalysts developed theories about encoding methods. They hypothesized that song sequences might represent codes, that broadcaster selections signaled different message types, that timing and frequency variations carried data. Testing these hypotheses required extensive mathematical analysis, statistical methods, and comparing decoded possibilities against intelligence from other sources to verify accuracy. Some codes were partially broken. Allied intelligence likely succeeded in decoding simpler systems, musical sequence codes, obvious numerical patterns, and some verbal substitution ciphers, but more sophisticated codes, particularly those requiring physical codebooks possessed only by Japanese agents, remained impenetrable without capturing the codebooks themselves. Captured Japanese intelligence documents occasionally provided breakthroughs. When Allied forces overran Japanese positions, they sometimes captured codebooks, cipher materials, and intelligence documents that referenced Radio Tokyo broadcasts. These captures allowed cryptanalysts to retroactively decode previous broadcasts and understand encoding systems, then apply that knowledge to current broadcasts. The intelligence value of decoded Radio Tokyo messages varied. Some signals transmitted routine operational information, confirmation of orders already sent through other channels, acknowledgement of received communications, or low-priority logistical details. But other messages contained valuable intelligence, coordinates for submarine rendezvous, information about Japanese agent networks in Allied territories, or strategic communications that provided insights into Japanese planning. Allied intelligence faced decisions about how to exploit decoded information without revealing that they'd broken the codes. If they acted too obviously on intelligence derived from Radio Tokyo broadcasts, Japanese commanders might realize their codes were compromised and change them. This created the same operational security dilemma that surrounded breaking Japanese naval codes. Intelligence was only valuable if it could be used without revealing its source. In some cases, decoded Radio Tokyo intelligence provided warnings about Japanese operations that allowed Allied forces to prepare without revealing code-breaking capabilities. For instance, if decoded messages indicated Japanese submarine movements, Allied anti-submarine forces might accidentally patrol areas where submarines were likely to appear, maintaining the fiction of lucky detection rather than decoded intelligence. The extent of Allied success in breaking Radio Tokyo codes remains partially classified. Declassified documents confirm that Allied intelligence knew broadcasts contained coded messages and achieved some decryption success. But the full scope, how many codes were broken, how much intelligence was extracted, and how effectively it was used operationally remains uncertain due to ongoing intelligence classification. This uncertainty is typical of World War II code-breaking history. Allied intelligence services remain reluctant to fully declassify information about cryptanalyst successes, particularly regarding codes that remained unbroken. Revealing that specific codes were never broken might compromise related modern systems or techniques. So the complete story of Radio Tokyo's secret signals and Allied efforts to decode them may never be fully known.
The aftermath, post-war justice, and memory. When World War II ended, American authorities faced complex questions about prosecuting Radio Tokyo broadcasters. Some clearly deserved punishment for treasonous propaganda. Others were victims forced into broadcasting under threat of death. Determining who deserved prosecution and who deserved sympathy proved extraordinarily difficult. Eva Toguri became the scapegoat for American anger about Tokyo Rose propaganda. She was arrested in occupied Japan, brought back to America, and tried for treason. The trial was deeply problematic. Prosecutors used coerced testimony, suppressed exculpatory evidence, and appealed to anti-Japanese prejudice that remained strong after the war. Toguri was convicted despite weak evidence and serious questions about whether her broadcasts actually met legal definitions of treason. Her conviction satisfied public demand for someone to pay for Tokyo Rose propaganda, but it was likely a miscarriage of justice. Toguri served 6 years in prison before being released in 1956. For decades afterward, she maintained her innocence, claiming she'd been forced into broadcasting and had attempted to undermine Japanese propaganda while appearing to comply. In 1977, after investigative journalism revealed prosecutorial misconduct and false testimony at her trial, President Gerald Ford granted Toguri a full pardon. Other Radio Tokyo broadcasters faced different fates. Ruth Hayakawa, another American-Japanese broadcaster, was never prosecuted, partly because she'd returned to Japan before war ended and remained there. Myrtle Lipton, the Australian nurse forced to broadcast as a prisoner of war, was treated as a victim rather than a collaborator. Australian authorities recognized that prisoners couldn't be held responsible for propaganda they were tortured into speaking. Japanese officials who ran Radio Tokyo's propaganda operations faced prosecution for war crimes. Commanders responsible for forcing prisoners to broadcast propaganda were tried and some executed. The distinction drawn was clear. Japanese who coerced propaganda were criminals, but prisoners and civilians forced to participate were victims, not perpetrators. The Tokyo Rose legend persisted in American popular culture long after the war, divorced from historical reality. Tokyo Rose became a cultural symbol, the seductive enemy propagandist, the voice trying to break American morale. Books, movies, and television shows featured fictionalized Tokyo Rose characters that bore little resemblance to the real women who'd broadcast for Radio Tokyo. This mythologization erased the complex reality. There was no single Tokyo Rose, but multiple women in varied circumstances. Some were coerced prisoners, others stranded civilians, still others willing collaborators. Their motivations ranged from survival to ideology to genuine belief in Japan's cause. Reducing them to a one-dimensional myth did injustice to their actual experiences. The secret signals aspect of Radio Tokyo remained classified for decades. Few people knew that broadcasts had contained coded intelligence, that Japanese agents throughout the Pacific had listened for hidden messages, or that Allied intelligence had partially broken some codes. This dimension of the story only emerged gradually as documents were declassified. Modern analysis of Radio Tokyo broadcasts continues. Historians and cryptographers study preserved recordings, searching for patterns and codes that might reveal additional intelligence about Japanese operations. Some codes likely remain unbroken, messages transmitted and received during the war but never decoded by Allied intelligence and now impossible to decrypt without codebooks lost to history. The women who broadcast for Radio Tokyo mostly lived quiet lives after the war. Some returned to America and disappeared into anonymity, their Radio Tokyo experiences rarely discussed. Others remained in Japan or Australia, building post-war lives separate from wartime experiences. Few wanted to be remembered for propaganda broadcasting, whether coerced or willing. Eva Toguri lived until 2006, dying at age 90. She spent her final decades running a small store in Chicago, largely unknown despite her former notoriety. In her later years, she gave occasional interviews, still insisting she'd been wrongly convicted, still carrying the burden of being America's Tokyo Rose scapegoat. Her pardon vindicated her legally, but couldn't restore the years lost to unjust imprisonment or erase the stigma she'd carried for 6 decades.
Radio Tokyo's broadcasts during World War II operated on multiple levels. Obvious propaganda visible to everyone, hidden intelligence readable only by those with keys to decode it. This dual nature represents something fundamental about information warfare. Messages can serve multiple purposes simultaneously, speaking different meanings to different audiences. Radio Tokyo's broadcasts demoralized some Allied soldiers while entertaining others. They spread lies that some believed and others mocked. They contained codes that Japanese agents read while American soldiers heard only music and propaganda. The same broadcast, the same voice, the same words meant different things depending on who listened and how they listened. This reminds us that information is never simple. Every message can carry multiple meanings. Every broadcast can serve multiple purposes. Radio Tokyo seemed to be straightforward propaganda, and for most listeners it was. But hidden within that propaganda was an intelligence network operating in plain sight, sending messages that millions heard but only a few could read. The women who broadcast for Radio Tokyo, coerced, willing, or somewhere between, were trapped in impossible situations. They spoke words they may not have believed, played roles they may not have chosen, and became symbols they never asked to represent. Some resisted as best they could. Others simply survived. Few emerged from the experience without trauma. Their stories remind us that propaganda warfare has human costs beyond battlefield casualties. The women forced to broadcast propaganda suffered psychological harm. The soldiers listening to broadcasts faced psychological warfare designed to break their morale. The families hearing names of captured loved ones endured cruel uncertainty. Propaganda was violence of a different kind, violence against minds and hearts rather than bodies. The secret signals hidden in Radio Tokyo's broadcasts reveal sophisticated intelligence tradecraft.
Japanese communications officers developed encoding systems that exploited entertainment broadcasting, hiding military intelligence where everyone could hear it but only trained agents could decode it. Allied intelligence eventually detected and partially decoded these signals, adding another dimension to the Pacific War's intelligence battles. Today, as we navigate our own era of information warfare, psychological operations, and hidden messages in plain sight, Radio Tokyo's dual-nature broadcasts offer lessons. Messages contain layers. Propaganda serves multiple purposes. Entertainment can disguise intelligence, and listeners must always question not just whether information is true, but what hidden meanings it might carry, what purposes it serves beyond obvious ones, and who benefits from us believing it. If this deep dive into Radio Tokyo's dual role as propaganda and intelligence network captivated you, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex, hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised that Radio Tokyo broadcasts contained secret intelligence signals? Can you see parallels to modern information warfare and hidden communications? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? The Nazis' use of neutral country radio? Soviet propaganda networks in occupied Europe? The psychological warfare campaigns in the China-Burma-India theater? Share this video with anyone fascinated by psychological warfare, intelligence operations, codes hidden in plain sight, or the untold stories of women caught in the machinery of propaganda warfare. Until then, remember, the most dangerous broadcasts are often those that sound like simple entertainment. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.